Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This is the Saline City Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, June 26, 2024. Will the recording secretary please call the roll?
Young.
Here.
Carroll.
Here.
Fosdick.
Here.
Morrow.
Here.
Gearba.
Here.
Cole.
Here.
Heft.
Here.
Lafort is absent. Trika.
Here.
Staff present tonight are City Planner Arbach, Community Development Director Harrington, and Recording Secretary Katnick. Is there a motion on the table to approve the agenda as distributed?
Move to approve as distributed, Madam Chair.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion on the table to approve the meeting minutes of May 8th, 2024 as submitted?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Public comment. Under the Open Meetings Act, any citizen may come forward at this time and make comments. The person is requested but not required to state their name and address for the record. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes per person. Seeing no one in the room, we will start with public hearing number 24-10, zoning amendment, creating ordinance number 867, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 7, to provide flexibility in the application of exterior material requirements for industrial building design standards. In our packet, we had a memo dated June 6, 2024 from Community Development Director Harrington.
Okay, perfect. So it's Ordinance 867, Action Item 2410, Industrial Building Design Standards. So the location, like all of our other ordinances, is citywide. The proposed changes affect the I-2 and I-4 properties primarily, as they are our industrial districts, although SPA 1 also has some industrial properties that would be affected by this ordinance change. Like other ordinances, the regulation does not usurp private deeds or development agreements or leases. Many of our industrial parks are under some sort of, or I guess not many, but we have the Sauk Trails Covenants Committee that has its own design standards, which is administered by the city. So this ordinance does not necessarily change or reflect those. Those are still at the discretion of the city. The Planning Commission reviewed 2 expansions on industrial buildings early this year. One was for Lee Bear, the other was for Condat. The owners of those properties struggled to aesthetically and functionally comply with our rigid existing standards, which cap the specific proportion of various building materials that may be used as the finish for the exterior of industrial buildings. So what ultimately you see from the street side, the facade, the elevation, whatever you would like to call it. The ZBA agreed that the owners faced real practical difficulties with complying with our ordinance, but the first criteria of a non-use variance is that the property could not be used for a permitted purpose. Because these are fundamentally aesthetic requirements, that's a rather difficult thing to prove, and thus making them not particularly great candidates for a variance. However, the city had previously granted variances for the exact same reason in 2018, also for Lee Bear, again, under the guise that the property owner faces a real practical difficulty, and the manner in which our first non-use variance criteria is written is not really a good mesh for this. The ZBA was supportive of the variances, but ultimately instructed the staff to bring an ordinance forward for review by the Planning Commission. We held that discussion earlier this year. I had the specific date in the packet, but there appeared to be consensus in providing Planning Commission more discretion in allowing deviations from the rigid proportion standards, similar to the right of the Planning Commission to allow deviations in off-street parking spaces. Hopefully the slides will come back up in a minute, but just as a note, the standards for these design apply to all new construction of principal buildings, additions to existing principal buildings, and new accessory buildings exceeding 1,000 square feet. The reconstruction of existing buildings where it's more than 50% of the original footprint, which is very similar standard to our non-conforming clause. And then the requirements of this section shall apply to existing building if an addition exceeds 50% of the original footprint. So Condat did not meet the third one. The only thing they needed a variance for was the portion that was the cold storage facility, as is over 1,000 square feet. But again, looking at that specific case, there are issues with choosing a different material than the one they had on the other ends of the structure, both aesthetically and functionally. The weight of heavier materials in the sheet metal would have proposed a real engineering difficulty for them. Perfect. So I'm not going to read most of this slide. Essentially, though, it references Table 1 which are the proportions allowed for these exterior wall materials. Next slide. So this is table 1, essentially establishes a percentage of the area that the building can show. So like brick clay, for example, could be 100% of the building on all 3 sides, or on all 4 sides, excuse me, both the side elevations and the front and rear. As you can see, they're pretty rigid proportions. I would beg to differ that, or beg to challenge that 25% of metal ribbed or seamed probably doesn't look all that different from 26% metal ribbed or seamed, and we likely have applicants that might have a real reason for needing that extra percent, or perhaps needing a deviation otherwise from some of these. So in the interest of trying to move these issues along and not necessarily needing to go to the variance process, the proposed change is on the next slide, which is flexibility in application. That's nearly identical to what we have for off-street parking, but the city recognizes that due to specific requirements and challenges of any given development, inflexible application of the industrial design standards set forth in section 7.16, table 1, may result in development with unattractive or impractical design. These situations may lead to conflicts with the character of the area, clashing with existing material, and hindrances to the overall functionality and efficiency of a property. The Planning Commission may permit deviations from the requirements and may allow more of a given material when it finds that such a deviation is necessary to ensure alignment with the specific characteristics of the area and parcel under consideration. Pretty basic questions. Are the proposed changes sufficient? Are you comfortable with them? Should the flexibility be extended to the other aspects of the ordinance beyond just the exterior material percentages? I'm pretty ambivalent about this. There are requirements to put up a parapet to hide mechanical equipment. I don't know if we necessarily want to provide discretion for all of those things. I think the percentages themselves provide a metric for us to gauge and evaluate proposals off of, but allowing some flexibility in their application, I think, is only to the benefit of the city to ensure that we're getting the development product that we want. As for the last question, should the percentages be removed altogether and qualitative standards set? That's definitely one option we can go. I don't prefer the percentages necessarily, but I do think, again, it provides a clear metric so we can evaluate what someone's asking to deviate from versus a qualitative proposal is a little bit more at the Planning Commission's discretion. Either way, though, I would support that. If we would like to reevaluate this ordinance wholesale, we can obviously postpone action on this and rework it. But this is a pretty easy fix, I think, to at least ensure that these types of proposals don't go to the ZBA anymore, don't waste our property owners' time, and as well as just provides the Planning Commission, the body that's kind of determining aesthetics and land use for the city, the discretion to determine aesthetics and land use for the city. So my recommendation is that if you're find the ordinance sufficient, that you recommend adoption of it to the City Council. But if you'd like to see other modifications made in the ordinance, I would recommend you postpone it. Due to other events happening in my life, I'm getting married in a month, I would ask that you postpone it to July 24th so I have adequate time to have a legal review it as well.
Great, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington. Overall, I think this recommendation is prudent, and I'm very supportive. As a matter of policy and procedure for both the Planning Commission's benefit and the public's. So if a recommendation is made tonight on this action item or any subsequent action items, because they're all ordinance changes, they'll first go to council, our new council policy subcommittee, and then to City Council, correct? Yes. So when we had our second meeting with the policy committee, what was elucidated to me is that they had no particular preference if it went to planning for or if it went to them before, but they would definitely need to see it before it went to City Council. So yes, in this event, it will go to the policy committee next Monday, July 1st. Provided you move recommendation on it, and then it would go to the City Council after that. If you would prefer it the other way, it's fine by me. I see you both as policy committees in different ways. Your policy committees from the land use perspective, and then kind of inheriting an aspect of code enforcement, that policy committee of council is looking at administrative and political issues that might align with these policies as well. No, I think the way you have formatted this is correct, which it starts at planning, and then before it gets to City Council, it's reviewed by a portion of City Council who serves on our policy subcommittee. So I think that was perfectly appropriate. If this item is approved tonight and the subsequent items, will all of them be on the policy subcommittee agenda for this coming Monday? That is my intention, yes. Okay, very good. That's all I had. Thank you.
Thank you. Additional questions for Mr. Harrington? Yes.
So Ben, when you're looking at this, what have you seen in other communities? Because I'm going to be asking a similar question to the other
Well, Sports Academy is actually interesting because it should have gotten a variance. I actually looked at that one specifically in relation to this ordinance to figure out what happened. Before it was constructed, it was required to get a variance per the site plan, and it never did.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I'm trying to figure out is, so we do away with the variance, which I have no problem reducing it. My concern, though, is becoming more subjective than objective in ways that we make sure that it happens. So by eliminating this table, which is what you're kind of proposing, how do you make sure that we actually get a quality product?
Well, you would have to find a reason or rationale for the deviation in the same way that you're technically required to for parking. So the expectation is that they meet the aspects of the table, and then the Planning Commission may grant a deviation, but you're under by no means required to grant the deviation. I'd also point to the Libre project as maybe an example of where the developer didn't use a cheaper material. The type of product they were using has a specific finish look to it that mimics metal seamed rib, but in reality, it had a higher insulative quality than brick. So there are other reasons for them to use that material, which happened to be a lot more expensive than traditionally what our ordinance was regulating. So I think our ordinance is already using, under the guise of objectivity, is incredibly subjective. By providing a number, it's not necessarily more objective because how we classify these materials is rather confusing. You could argue that a portion of this ordinance already provides you discretion by saying, well, if it's not really how we want to interpret metal seamed rib, then you're already given under like clause 2 of the ordinance. If Ben, you can pull that back up. It's on current ordinance. You had the ability to provide a maximum proportion and deviation based on you classifying the material differently. So I think that the deviation allows you to maybe more academically look at it, as well as, again, kind of go off of some standard that's set versus doing it entirely qualitatively. Mr. Auerbach might be more familiar with other communities' policies on industrial building design, though.
For specific, not as much specifically for industrial buildings, but I would say that adding provisions to allow practical flexibility when, for example, there was a facade or a building elevation that wasn't as visible from a public street. That's just one of many examples where it just makes practical sense to have the ability to grant waiver, and it wouldn't necessarily be appropriate to send the applicants like that to the ZBA. I think that this amendment would still give you more teeth in the way Mr. Harrington described. Applicants would have to meet the percentage tables, and you could, on a case-by-case basis, allow deviations. I think that method is probably one of the better options than going looser still and only having very generalized language, just saying along the lines of compatibility with adjacent buildings, because when push comes to shove, ultimately that's very difficult to enforce.
Yeah, and I think that's more what I'm concerned. I prefer actually not going to ZBA because I think planning has a better oversight of what's going on in buildings and stuff from that perspective. But the other piece of it just being, I don't necessarily want to allow the hodgepodge that's happened on Michigan Avenue in the Sauk Trail Park, where we've got a whole bunch of different looks and everything. That there's got to become some kind of uniformity at some point, because otherwise, the different uses that we have on there is one concern. But the looks of every one of those buildings just looks like something was thrown in there, and as long as we aren't giving up the entire ability to make a change or request a change, I think that's fine.
Right, yeah, it's just essentially making the deviation request go through the Planning Commission, which, to your point, I think is administratively easier, especially because the communication between the ZBA and the Planning Commission is not statutorily required, nor does it regularly occur. So I think this ensures that if it's on the site plan condition, and we have other procedures now in place to ensure that these conditions are enforced better, but it's definitely my preference that it all be dealt with by the body, and I think that you are all better judges of it. You're all chosen for the Planning Commission for specific reasons. The ZBA is fundamentally looking at different issues, so it makes more sense to me that it lay here.
And I agree. I think that we need to keep the table, but whenever an industrial building does come to us with maybe a deviation from the table and it doesn't meet what is in Table 1, I would ask that that be highlighted for us too, just to see that, if it is 26%, whatever, but if it goes to 75, and that should be, better than saying needs to look compatible with adjacent buildings. I would ask that you bring that to our attention too, so that we focus on that as well and not just let that one slide.
No, absolutely, and I'll say that Planner Auerbach does a phenomenal job of calling out those issues in his reports,
Right.
and which is why we were able to make sure that Lee Bayer and Condat got variances, unlike maybe past applicants who seemingly skirt around that, and I don't really know what you do with that at this point after it's been built and received a certificate of occupancy. So,
Any additional questions?
Madam Chair, if there are no additional questions, I'll move to acknowledge receipt of the memo of June 6th.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion on the table to open the public hearing at 7:28?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? All public comments to be heard, limit of 3 minutes per person. Seeing nobody in the room, I will move to close the public hearing at 7:29.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from Planning Commission members? All right, first question, are these proposed changes sufficient?
Sure.
Feel that it covered enough of it, and per our discussion, I feel comfortable with it. Does anybody feel
Agreed.
different? Excellent.
So that's a changing body, I'm fine with that.
Should the flexibility be extended to other aspects of the ordinance beyond just the exterior materials or percentages? I feel that you're opening a can of worms if you do that, because I don't think everything needs to be regulated, but that's just my opinion.
Perfectly stated.
Nothing else? Should the percentages be removed altogether and qualitative standards set? Feel that we're happy with keeping a table and highlighting if there is a difference from that table? Excellent. No additional questions? Is there a motion on the table to recommend to City Council to adopt or not to adopt new ordinance 867?
I'll make that motion.
To have it recommended to go to the policy.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I would recommend, unless there's objection for staff, all of these subsequent motions in which we're moving to recommend, while the policy committee is essentially a subset of council, I think it would be advantageous and beneficial to be more specific. So if someone would be willing to make the motion to recommend to the City Council Policy Subcommittee.
I'll make a motion to recommend the ordinance language, whatever, or document be forwarded to the City Council Policy Committee and then on to City Council.
I'd second that.
Any additional discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Number 24-11, zoning amendments, creating ordinance number 868, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 5 and 6 to streamline temporary use and structure regulations. In our packet, we have a memo dated June 10th from Community Development Director Harrington.
this is probably like my worst nightmare because this is one of the more dry things I've presented to you in my tenure, and to do it in this fashion probably isn't beneficial for anybody, but bear with me here. So Ordinance 868, Action Item 2411, Temporary Structures and Uses. Like all ordinances, it's a citywide change, and like other ordinances, the regulation does not usurp private deed, development agreements, or leases. Probably a little bit less relevant here, as landlords, at least commercial landlords, tend to be a little bit more free-flowing and less likely to restrict these types of events or types of uses on their property, but still relevant in case that does occur in our city. So to kind of give you some of the background and why I'm bringing this ordinance forward, temporary uses and structures have been a particularly convoluted and challenging mess during my tenure. The first challenge is the existing language of the regulations. They're less than clear, non-referential, redundant, and sometimes contradictory. The city has not historically applied these standards well or coherently. There are plenty of examples predating my tenure of events that seemed to miss the mark, others that were denied that made the mark. So the standards, when read from a more traditional perspective, are pretty much prohibitive of most types of special events and sales. Property owners have usually elected for the ask for forgiveness route, opting to do events on weekends when staff are not present or monitoring situations in that or otherwise hosted events without letting the city know. In the last 2 years, staff have received only a single complaint about a temporary use, so they're not causing mass nuisances, from my understanding. However, in the interest of safety and well-being and access to these properties, I think there's a way that we can kind of have our cake and eat it too, make the regulations more streamlined while also making sure we have a really good idea of what's going on people's property and that it's not posing a threat or an issue to anybody. More recently, about why I feel this is necessary, we've developed more active members of our communities. RU Game and the strip center that belongs or is occupied by Imagine has become more collaborative with itself and is looking to hold more special events. Reinhardt Realtors has now started kind of an annual mini golf thing for charity in their parking lot. And then we obviously have an art shop downtown that has had more outdoor special events, definitely more on the Ask for Forgiveness team, if you ask me. But again, we have people who are really interested in having events in our community, and they're good events, they're well-attended events, but I think there's a better way to regulate them and to enforce them than what we're currently doing now. I'll add that reducing restrictions on temporary uses and events is becoming more of a best practice in local planning from the APA, the Urban Land Institute. Restrictions like ours force the city itself to have a monopoly on community events, and I don't think the city, I can't speak for the city council, really wants to have that responsibility. It would be great to have some of the burden lifted off of the city for other folks to be able to hold community events rather than it all being on the city's dime and the city's liability. I worked with legal counsel and reviewed other temporary use ordinances from communities near and far to develop the proposed ordinance for you today. I called the city of Brighton, which recently changed its temporary use ordinance and made it a lot more relaxed, again, kind of providing broad administrative review rather than nitpicking every little thing. It sounds like they still have some kinks to work out with some hagglers in their ordinance, other specific regulations, but it seems like they're also moving in this direction of how can we get more property owners to kind of take on the role of a community event host. So the current aspects of the ordinance we're going to be talking about are temporary structures, types of sales that occur outside the building, and then all other types of temporary uses, events, et cetera. So temporary structures are regulated in our code currently in two places, Section 504, temporary structures and building, and then again are mentioned in Section 616, temporary structures and uses. Section 504 really contains the bulk of the standards, and we're talking about genuine, interesting cases of temporary structures. So emergency dwellings is one. If someone's house burns down, there's a whole policy about how we pull two people from the city council, and then we make a determination about whether the emergency dwelling is placed appropriately. It hasn't happened in my tenure. Construction trailers, and then specifically portable tents, which is a bigger one and something we really looked at with this. And then Section 616 has some mild commentary on temporary structures, despite it having the name of the section. And they're primarily related to construction activity, where construction trailers, offices can be located, model homes, and rules that they can't modify any permanent structure, and that's not necessarily featured in Section 504. Moving on to the sales, we regulate outdoor sales in three places. Section 511, which is outdoor displays of product or materials intended for retail sale or rental. Section 512, transient and seasonal sales. And Section 616.4, temporary outdoor sales and services. Section 511 applies to the principal business, and that's going to be a term that comes up quite a bit because there's some nuance here. A principal business means the primary user. So if I'm going to Best Buy is the principal user of that property. If I go to Baker's Nook or Christina Sweet Treats or Shake Shack, those would all be principal users of that property, someone who's fundamentally occupying the space and operating out of it. So it applies, Section 511 applies to principal businesses displaying items sold inside their store on a regular basis, just outside of their building. People put up clothes racks outside, that type of thing, if they're a retail store. Section 512 applies to the sale of perishable seasonal items, examples of which are Christmas trees, flowers and plants, pumpkins, and fruit and beverages by persons other than the owner or the occupant of the premises. Firework vendors are a topical one, and not only because they're discussed heavily in this ordinance, but also because Jake's Fireworks just opened up on the west side of town. And again, it would be an example of a transient or a seasonal sale. It's based off a specific activity. We've had a couple produce vendors pop up in the community over the past couple of years. They would also be another example of that. And then lastly, Section 616.4 contains regulations on outdoor sales and services, but then also lists events that are not sales or services, such as grand openings, special events, or holiday celebrations. It's not clear if they have to be selling something at those events for them to qualify, if they then fall under assembly or fundraising, which has a vastly different regulation and rule attached to it. And it says the regulations are in addition to 5.11, which is how you can display those products outside. But obviously, if you're not selling anything as a special event, I don't see how the 511 would then be relevant. So this kind of runs our first crossroads here of our ordinances refer to themselves sometimes, but when they do, it's not particularly clear about what they mean or what we're trying to accomplish with them. And then lastly, temporary uses are all regulated in one place beyond the sales and the buildings. So section 616 is temporary structures and uses, which houses most of our current ones. So temporary sales that seemingly include far more than just temporary sales, as I mentioned, assembly and fundraising activities, garage sales, and then transient and seasonal sales, which is essentially just a copy-paste restatement from section 512. So I have this in your packet, but we were hoping to accomplish about 3 big things with this. So one was to streamline and clean up the standards across these 4 sections. So our current regulations for temporary structures and uses are convoluted and scattered. And then propose updates that organize the code in a sensible way and clearly address nuances, especially as it relates to outdoor sales, as there's kind of 3 different parties involved with these. It relaxes the rigid standards for temporary uses on private property. The current standards are seemingly pretty prohibitive for pop-up sales and community events that are not planned, organized, and managed by the city itself on city property. Relaxing these standards allows businesses and property owners to hold their own events, increasing the overall vibrancy of our community, and then provides the city with really clear review authority for temporary uses and structures. And this is something that I saw other cities had across the board that we didn't. It allows multiple city departments, including police and fire, to review temporary uses and structures to ensure that they will not cause safety, access, or nuisance issues. And it also allows departments to establish conditions for any permits to ensure their concerns are addressed. So it's kind of twofold. Not only are we all collectively reviewing these if this proposed ordinance goes through, but then we can all collectively add our own conditions similar to how we do for our own public events. And I think that that provides us a lot more security in making sure these events are being managed properly. And like a lot of other things, it's kind of a case-by-case issue. Some properties are more suitable for temporary events and some are not. And allowing this broad review authority allows us to create our own policy standards of how we're going to really be reviewing these things and ensuring that we're doing it correctly. Okay, so here's the meat and potatoes. Like I said, I apologize. This is probably the more drier end of things that we've done. So first one is tents. Some of the language was slightly modified to clarify that permits would be required for tent structures, including a tent certificate of occupancy for larger tent structures, those that are over 200 square feet. So if it's not like your generic pop-up that you're buying from Menards, but it's a full-on professional tent, they pose real wind issues. So it's something the building official and I have already looked at for some of these seemingly on the line temporary events to ensure that they're anchored properly, that their tent's not going to get blown by the wind and take somebody out. The next one, too, is broad review authority, making sure that DPW, the police and fire can all look at these as well as the building department to ensure that they're being arranged in a way that does not block a fire lane by accident, which I think has been a concern on some of these. And then also that if police need access or are worried about how a structure might be used, et cetera. I'm going to try to speed through this. My nose has also started bleeding underneath this mask, so it's fun times all around. So again, broad review authority. Other standards have remained essentially the same. I'm not an expert on emergency dwellings. I showed it to the building official and he thought they looked adequate. Same thing with other types of temporary structures. We're not really proposing to reinvent the wheel here. These have not been the primary problem. I will add that tent structures are limited to 48 or 72 hours. I think we moved it to 72 hours so we could actually enforce it. So there is a time limit established for the tent structures. So for sales, as I outlined in the packet, we're proposing to kind of condense our various understandings of sales into 3 types. So one is a principal user selling items they regularly sell inside their own store. The second is transient or seasonal sales, which have a longer time limit than these other 2 types of sales and are somewhat unique because they represent kind of different parties than what we would expect with these other 2. And the third one is all other types of outdoor sales. So non-principal users selling items that are not regularly sold inside the principal user store, or the principal user selling items not related to the store operations. Yeah. So to go through these one by one, principal user selling items they regularly sell inside their store. So this is trying to make section 512 into what I think it's meant to be, which are display standards for people having outdoor displays. They're laid out to narrowly regulate principal users selling items they regularly sell inside their store. The regulations are effectively the same as they are currently, but again, really draws the line that this is someone who owns a store who's putting a rack of clothing out on the sidewalk for people to kind of see. or on their strip center. They're not inviting other parties to come and operate items on their site. Again, it's just meant to be very straightforward. It has to be clean and orderly. The clearance is required if it's on the sidewalk. It can't block emergency access. These are all standards that currently exist in our code. It can only be conducted during normal business hours. If we think that it poses a real hazard or an issue, we can take it to the Planning Commission if they have a dispute. It does not allow such sales or displays to take by right on any industrial or residential property, so it's confined to only essentially retailers in the commercial districts. That said, there's no permit that we're proposing to be required for this type of sale. It's someone who's bringing things in as an extension of their building. It's temporary, and non-principal users selling goods or goods being sold that are not regularly kept in storage or any other sort of deviation from hours would then automatically fall under our temporary use provision. So this is very narrowly tailoring what they can do by right without a permit as outdoor displays, and then if they want to deviate from that, that's fine, but then they have to apply for a temporary use permit. Moving on to transient and seasonal sales, again, we think that a lot of this is pretty adequate as it is. It's just a matter of kind of cleaning up some references to the code itself. But these are codes that are, these are sales that take longer. They're a fireworks tent that's up for a month, or a produce stand that's up for the harvest season, or a Christmas tree farm. They're not up for just 3 or 4 days. They're looking for a longer period of time. So our goal is to allow such sales in more districts, the SPA1, the I1, the I2, and current provisions for C2 and C3 and downtown. Firework tents, this is my pet issue here, is the staff have had numerous issues with firework sellers and vendors. This year has been no different. This code update would classify it as special land use to temporarily sell explosive materials, meaning they would have to have their applications to us a few months in advance with a clear operation plan and an idea and understanding of what they're going to do. They would need to have permits several days in advance. We could set as a common condition of that type of special land use. And it's not just the community development department from a zoning perspective and signage. It's the building department with safety and how they anchor these tents or don't. It's the fire department with how little notice they're given and how they display their products and sleeping on site. It's the police department with some of the people who operate out of these tents. It's been, and the clerk too, I should mention, because these are all licensed operations as well through our transient and seasonal licensing process. So it's been a real nuisance for 3 out of my 3 years here. And I think that we don't have to ban them outright, but we can at least ensure that we're better prepared for them every year, rather than one of our busiest times is the end of June being hammered by a bunch of people who are not filing inspections, who are not properly anchoring their tents, who are posing a nuisance and a safety hazard to our residents. And that carries us into the last point. Throughout this, you'll see that past nuisances, we have a very clear code that if we document a past nuisance, we have the right to withhold permits in the future. Then for all other outdoor sales, so I'm not someone who's displaying my rack of clothing outside my shop. I'm not someone who's selling produce or Christmas trees or fireworks. I'm looking to do a pop-up art sale downtown on a private parking lot. We're added a broad review authority. So again, we all have the right as city departments to review and add conditions to permit issuances. We're allowing sales in many more districts. We're not necessarily prohibiting other districts outside of residential from having these, but again, because of that broad review authority, it's not something I'm particularly concerned about. Properties will be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. We recently saw one of the Woodland properties that as Woodland and Maple, the UAW Hall, for example, is obviously not a typical office service building, which tends to be more small and confined into a neighborhood. Perhaps the way we would review a temporary sale or event on that property would be very different than how we might want to review it on a much more confined, not as easily maneuverable property. Clear permitting requirements. The proposed ordinance lists the needed materials for submittal, including a site plan that identifies all proposed activity areas, temporary and permanent structures, fire lanes, and accessible parking spaces, which has been another hot button issue this summer with ADA access at one of our breweries. And then lastly, or not lastly, but it requires a principal user to be the applicant. This is something I had to vet with legal. But essentially, it doesn't even give the owner of a property necessarily the right to apply for it. It gives the business the right to apply for it. Obviously, they would have to do that in conjunction with the owner of the property to make sure they're using it appropriately. But this makes sure that BlackRock, who owns the one strip center with high society, Hungry Howie's, et cetera, can't just sell out their parking lot unbeknownst to the businesses that actually operate there. The business has to have some sort of ownership and responsibility over it, which I think definitely helps us in the future. It also doesn't prohibit, if one person does it poorly, necessarily the next person from having an opportunity to maybe do it a little bit better. The sales do not have to be conducted by or in support of a nonprofit. Our current ordinance kind of tailors that. I asked legal, and they're not necessarily sure of the enforceability of that standard. If providing $1 of a donation to Saline Social Services would meet that criteria of doing something in support of a nonprofit. I don't necessarily see the value of it having that as a strict requirement, although I think we would absolutely encourage it. There's proposed to be no limit on occurrences. Currently, outdoor sales are limited to 2 per year. We have people who would like to be more active in our community to have more frequent art pop-ups or I can't tell you what the other things they sell at these, but it's usually art. If the applicant remains in good standing and neither they, the property, or their invited vendors become a nuisance, they may continue regularly conducting temporary sales. And we can establish a nominal permit fee for that as well to ensure that we're not wasting our time as a city staff reviewing all of these without some sort of compensation for that time, as we're probably removing ourselves from other work items. And then duration, there's no formal limit, as I mentioned, besides that the such sales are allowed to occur for up to 2 consecutive days. They can begin no earlier than 8 and end no later than 8 when adjacent to residential, 11 p.m. otherwise. It's identical to what the current standard is. And the opening and closing times can be more strict or lenient as a condition of police, fire, DPW, community development, building department review. And there must be a minimum of 3 days in between sales. I'm sure we all have met somebody who's kind of had the perpetual garage sale, and this prevents that from happening as well. We're also proposing to remove arbitrary size requirements. So it currently caps the sale area at 800 square feet in area and 40 linear feet. Again, with this broad review authority that we're affording the city, I think it's more than fair to assume that we can adequately determine if it's going to cause an access issue or a nuisance issue, which is ultimately what this criteria is likely trying to push against. And then again, as I mentioned, if it's a past nuisance, we have the ability to withhold the permit as a condition of this ordinance. Moving on to temporary uses, thankfully. So we kind of called out 3 specific types of temporary uses looking at what the existing code currently has. So one is outdoor sales, which we already discussed. The last one is garage sales, which are pretty straightforward in our code. I'm not proposing to change anything with that. And then assembly and fundraising activities is the other one. As I mentioned, currently our temporary sales and services include activities that are not a temporary sale or service by saying a special event or a holiday celebration. So which criteria we're supposed to be enforcing leads to real difficulties and consequences. Our assembly and fundraising activities can only occur on institutional properties, which would then negate pretty much any business that's had some sort of assembly activity occur on its property, up to and including likely a grand opening, where again, they're not necessarily selling anything. But would the hotel be permitted, to have its grand opening or not? That's not exactly clear, but at the same time, I can't identify any harm that was done by hosting that event. And very similar to the other ones, broad review authority, allowing these events to happen in more districts, clear permitting requirements, still requires the principal user to be the applicant for the event. The sales do not have to be events does not have to be conducted by or in support of a nonprofit or on institutional property. It can be done by any commercial property for whatever event that they want to hold, if it's just a community gathering. It retains existing nuisance prevention standards related to food prep and sanitary facility location. Essentially, you can't put your barbecue right on the house, right on the property line with the residents. You can't put your outhouse right on the line with the residents. They have to be set in. I believe the standard for both of those is 200 to 250 feet. It has an increased allotment. Currently, they can happen up to 4 times in a calendar year, and I think the more generous allotment for assembly and fundraising activities was based off the fact it could only happen on institutional properties. Not that we necessarily define that either, but it's neither here nor there. We're proposing to allow them up to 12 times per year. Again, the logic is to allow strip centers in our community to host something monthly if that's their prerogative. Sales are approved in conjunction with the assembly or fundraising activity, but they have to be notated on the site plan. The duration is pretty much the same. Although, I need to change that. The slide is not correct. So look at your packet. The duration, they can have it up to 3 days, but they can only have it up to 3 days, and they can only have 12 per year. Again, past nuisance, the city can withhold a permit. And then similarly, for residential properties, I'm not proposing that someone's backyard party for a graduate or a wedding or whatever the situation might be would be subject to this ordinance. It's subject to other nuisances that we have in our city related to light, sound, trespassing, disorderly behavior, whatever it might be. Most cities, from my knowledge, don't regulate people's backyard parties, but if I'm incorrect with that assumption, Mike, please correct me. So this has 6 considerations that are pretty lofty, and I'm sure that you probably have some of your own as well. Does the Planning Commission generally agree that the standards for temporary uses and events should be more relaxed? If not, does the Planning Commission at least agree that the current ordinance language is rather unclear? 2, is the Planning Commission okay with their proposal to make firework vendors special land users? 3, is the Planning Commission okay with their proposal to allow transient seasonal sales, temporary outdoor sales, and assembly events in more zoning districts? 4, is the Planning Commission comfortable with the level of discretion for condition or reviews given to city departments? 5, does the Planning Commission have any concerns with the allowed frequency or duration of events? And then 6, are there other specific concerns or questions that you have looking through the ordinance? I do not necessarily anticipate you recommending and moving forward on this evening. There are a lot of things in here, and I think there's probably going to be a variety of different opinions on this issue. So if you do all surprisingly feel comfortable with this, please do recommend the adoption to the City Council Policy Committee. But if not, I would recommend postponing to a date certain no sooner than July 24th so that I can make the necessary amendments and have our legal counsel review it.
Great, thank you. Questions for Mr. Harrington?
I have a whole list, so I don't know if you want me to start, but, I mean, just ones that I start looking at. Frequency and the date that you could have 12 events over a short period of time, with just 3 days in between, I do not support that. 12 months, 12 events, kind of pushing it. I think that was the reason why we went with 4, so it wasn't continually being a nuisance, but maybe there's a compromise on that. I do have concerns about that we have requirements for parking based on the use of the building and facility, but do those go out the door when you are allowing these permits to basically take up chunks of the parking lot where they are no longer meeting those requirements? And what's the concern, as we just talked about, a parking variance issue just a minute ago? I don't believe that we really want to see office service and professional business districts having that kind of activity. What would be the purpose of that, just expanding it? I mean, most of our PV and OS is right situated with residential, so we would have that concern of impact on residential.
Yeah, and the goal was to expand it and with the broad review authority capture what wasn't there. Like I said, I was more thinking about the outliers in that specific instance, like those on the northern side of Michigan, West Michigan Ave. Granted, most of those are residences at this point, and then on Maple Road and perhaps even some on North Ann Arbor Street would be more prime for that. But like I said, I understand there's likely going to be some changes we want to make with this. So.
And doing the issue with having the Planning Commission be an appeal board, I feel that's becoming more political than it should be, because you're basically throwing it out there just like we do the council. Do you really want to have that kind of a...
That's actually an existing provision, so I left it in there out of curiosity of what you all thought about it. But I'm
remember that there's that I've never had in the issue that you mentioned about 2 individuals on council can be part of a board that improves emergency structures. I've never seen those apply
right.
any time in the last 25 years.
No, like I said, I don't think they're necessarily the most active or used of our ordinances. They exist probably, that the emergency dwelling one probably exists based off of some state law that mandated that it be written in a specific way. So, but yes, I have not seen a temporary or a transient or seasonal sale or an outdoor display be brought to the Planning Commission either.
So potentially that being removed, or I don't know how we would handle that differently, and not someone sort of that. When you mentioned other communities, you mentioned Brighton. Any other communities that you referred to?
Yeah, I can pull up the list.
The other issue, when we talk about seasonal definition and items, I mean, in your description, you show like items such as produce, beverages, or whatever else. But what about like mulch and all that? Speedway used to bring in pallets of mulch and set it out there everywhere on the property. And I know that you're trying to contain that, but that's a thing where it's not a product they sell all the time, but it could be considered seasonal, but it was a big eyesore. So that's an example of, I'm not sure what exactly all the seasonal items they can be. I do like the idea that you're bringing in the traffic and the police, but of course, that's always been a big concern in terms of traffic enforcement. In a couple of the areas that we do know where they currently are having a lot of festivals, depending on which day of the week it is, I'm concerned with traffic flow going out on US 12. Anytime we have 12 involved, cars going in and out of that, I don't know how that's going to be addressed. When you mentioned tents, and at one point in here you mentioned something about tents in the residential area. Currently there's a number of temporary structures where people are putting their cars under these portable carport tents. And there's like multiple moving through town. Is this only what we're discussing tonight, commercial and industrial property and not residential? There's something with the temporary structure, so is this applying to all zoning?
Yeah, the temporary structures in theory apply to all zoning types. I'm not familiar with the portable tent for the carport. I'd be interested in seeing it. I think I would have other issues with it, mainly on the zoning consideration of setbacks, and the building official likely have issues with it based on how it's being attached. Again, anything with some sort of roof becomes a wind load concern.
Yeah, they're those portable ones where they're made out of plastic pipe, and they're kind of like a, I don't know, an arch, whatever, but there's at least 3 or 4 I know in the city that have been put up, and people are storing their cars underneath it.
Do you want to send me a photo of one of that? Thank you.
But I just want to make sure that temporary structures is involving all properties.
Yeah, I think we'd probably consider that a tent structure at that point, given how it would be used and operated, because it doesn't have walls, obviously. And there is a provision here that limits the longevity of tent structures unless otherwise approved. So transient or seasonal sales, for example, that might be there for a few months could have a tent structure for a longer period of time, but for other people, it's the expectation that their tent comes up and their tent comes down, that they're not tents in parking lots.
And what was the reason behind the 120 days?
I think that's the existing provision as well. Same thing with the definition of a transient or seasonal sale. I didn't change the definition. I just looked at the standards for them.
All right, so my recommendation on the 120 days is to cut that in half. I think that's just providing way too much. The other one where you mentioned the sanitary bathrooms and such like that, would that mean that an individual company could put up a porta-john and leave it there all summer long or for the entire year?
No, that was specifically for the temporary use portion of the ordinance. So that's somebody who's having a special event. It's, like I said, the transient or seasonal sales are reviewed somewhat differently. But if they added a porta-john or a cooking on premises, that's obviously very different than somebody who's hosting like a large event. And that the former would not be allowed. Sorry, I'm a little scrambled today.
That's right. Because an example I'm thinking is even Baker's Nook, which we know is in compliance with the bathrooms, and now they have them having multiple events and you have to provide bathrooms, and they say, no, we can't use your bathrooms, so we'd like to put a porta-john, and they're allowed 12 events a year, then they leave a porta-john out in the parking lot, or those kind of things is where I'm seeing that kind of concern. And the other part in here, it mentioned something about non-residential properties in residential. Are those institutional properties such as churches and schools? And what oversight will we have on those?
Yeah, I'm not aware of any true commercial properties that are zoned residential with the exception of the hospital campus, which at one point was considered institutional, which is why it's in a residential zone. But yes, the other ones would be school property, which this ordinance doesn't apply to because it's zoning. And then the others would all be, it's churches, other types of nonprofit institutions.
Yeah, that's why I was just wondering, like those type of things that are, like even the parks or whatever, would be similar to that, but we have what we're saying.
Right, so yeah, the parks would go under the city's special event policy, but yeah, the non-residential properties in residential districts is primarily means church, so.
And when you mentioned about nuisance, so in that example, do we have to have a nuisance in place, or can the city just say, no, we're not going to allow you to have that permit, because we don't feel that
Yeah, I mean,
that is appropriate or may cause more of an issue?
yeah, with the broad review authority, we definitely have the ability to say, no, it's not satisfactory for the site. In theory, they could continue to whittle down whatever proposal they have until it would be something that the city departments would view as satisfactory and safe.
So if we ask for a site plan, as you mentioned, it
Yeah, that is correct.
And then lastly, I had a good example of when you talk about the sales must be part of the business that's there. Costco was making keys out of the parking lots. They brought in a van that was making keys. How would that play out in a example of
Oh, that's a very interesting example. I think that would be probably business activity taking place outside. It's not, I mean, they're literally manufacturing something in the parking lot. Again, though, it's a display of product. I guess, turn it back on you. Did you view it as a nuisance or a problem? Was it blocking traffic or?
I mean, it was right next to the handicap park.
So yeah, exactly. There would be the issue there. So.
But I mean, those type of businesses pop up, and then if you had that, that would be almost a regular business. If you approve it once a month for 3 days, is what you're saying, right? You'd have up to basically be able
Well, and that's a principal user selling an item they sell inside the store. I guess I would then challenge them that are you really selling keys inside the store if you're manufacturing them in your parking lot? So it's definitely a unique example, though. I'll say that.
And then lastly, we've had issues where, just like Tractor Supply put stuff out in their parking lot to sell it for storage and that type of thing. And seeing stuff stored in front, Dollar General does it all the time, puts all their stuff in front of the building. How will this impact that? Is it still going to allow all of that, and it has to be within so many feet of the building? Or that was kind of the concern we had with Ace when it was built, is that they had put up garage doors to actually close it off as part of the building, instead of having everything sitting out in front and looking at the nuisance.
Yeah, so I think that's primarily actually a function of the site plan for the storage. Again, this is all implying temporary, but if you're occupying a parking space 365 days a year with building material, that's very different than operating out of it 3 days a month, if that. I think that that's something the code enforcement will be focusing more on this summer is outdoor storage, because it's not just limited to the retail properties. We have many industrial properties that also take large generosities with our outdoor storage provisions.
And I think that's my concern from the seasonal aspect, that if you start allowing more frequent aspects and less in between times of when it's happening, you're going to start to see more of an issue. And I would like to see less, I think, from my perspective. Not 12 times a year. I know what you're trying to achieve, but it's like having those permanent garage sales, permanent things. And if you see it every single month at the same time, I just don't know at what point does that become reasonable in terms of traffic, and it starts to become a regular event, and it should be changed to the actual site plan and being an event that you just automatically get granted every month. So, I don't know what your opinion is on that, but I kind of feel that that's kind of what leads to this when you start adding frequency and more days to be able to do that. So.
Yeah. So just so I understand too, so assembly activities would be somebody having a special event. They're not necessarily selling something on their property. They're having a band in their parking lot, which is, like I said, I know the Imagine group is trying to arrange that to kind of do their own one-off Salty Summer Sounds or jazz in the parking lot kind of thing. That's allowed 12 times per year. But someone having like a pop-up art fair on their property, there's technically no limit to that currently with this proposed ordinance. So would you like to see a limit established for that as well?
Yeah, I think so, because I look at the example of, well, say at Baker's Nook, they have an event going almost every other weekend, and it's either a garage sale at one point, or it's a food rally, or it's an art sale, or whatever they think they can get in there to make money for the owner or whatever. So I'm not trying to discourage the use of private property, but I am concerned when parking and everything flows over into the other neighbors, and they're having to deal with issues that shouldn't be their responsibility because it's something that they have no control.
And then to kind of answer your question, so I looked at Pittsfield Township, Plymouth, Northville, Traverse City, Ypsilanti, Ann Arbor, Dexter, South Lyon, Milan, Howell, Chelsea, Brighton. And then asking ChatGPT, I looked at Miami, Baltimore, Las Vegas, and Los Angeles. The bigger cities have very different, different understandings of how to regulate these things, though. So they kind of mostly went out the window.
We'll stick with the small one.
Yeah. But I would say the general theme is that there's an ordinance very similar to ours that is very restrictive, but then looking at temporary events that happen in those communities, not strictly enforced either. I kind of borrowed that broad review authority from Pittsfield and Brighton. They both really allow the city departments to kind of use it at their discretion. Same thing with Milan, although I thought Milan's ordinance was even too vague. There were not enough guardrails, we can call them, to say, well, if you're a nuisance, we're not going to allow this. If if you're not being reviewed. So I think that the review needs to occur at somebody other than just the zoning administrator, community development director. So there's kind of a good balance that I think we can find with this ordinance.
I feel, these are just comments, but I feel that you're bringing in the alignment a lot of things that we need, and especially this review and bringing in the other parties that we do justice. I'm just more a little bit concerned with frequency, with time in between, and then really what gets down to being is what they're selling in terms of where is it being placed on the property and how it is, how long they keep it there. If they aren't actively selling it, it's stored there, and then you have to deal with a code enforcement thing, and knowing that we don't proactively do code enforcement, we're going reactive, it's just going to add more craziness to it. I just want to make sure we tag that. That's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you. Any additional comments?
No additional comments, Madam Chair. I'd move to acknowledge receipt of the June 10th, 2024 memo.
I'll second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to open the public hearing at 8:10?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. All public comments will be heard, a limit of 3 minutes per person.
Noting that there's no one in the audience, I'd move to close the public hearing at 8:10.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Comments, questions from Planning Commission members? Just my question to you is there seems to be a lot of things that need to be hammered out. Do you want us to go through this list or postpone to a date certain? How would you?
I mean, if you all have differing opinions, it'd be kind of good to know, or if you have another issue that you saw with it, whatever more feedback I can get, so we only have to do this twice. Like I said, I know it, and at the end of the day, it's a very dry ordinance, so.
Wouldn't it be more advantageous, considering the complexity and multidimensional nature of this proposal, perhaps to postpone to a date certain of that second meeting in July, and in the interim period in the next 2 weeks, if people have specific sections or additional language they'd like to consider, that they could put that in writing and email that to you?
Yeah, that would be fantastic.
Okay, and I would note, per the comment that was brought up about frequency of events, I think a fair compromise between 4 and 12 would be, let's do 8.
Okay. And then I guess that remains the other issue of other types of pop-up sales. There is no current cap on them. Assembly activity is different than a sale. So if we want to regulate the sale number a year, I would some feedback on that.
I would be amenable to that, and I think the 8 number seems reasonable, unless you have some metrics or data that would justify another number.
No, I would say that there's one group in particular that I can have them plead their own case and tell them that they would like to allow themselves to conduct as many sales as they seemingly would like to do, that they should come to the next Planning Commission meeting and explain exactly why that is. So I don't think I'm the one to bear that cross for them. So.
The other one for me is 3 days. I just don't think.
Right, we can extend that.
We extend it to maybe 2 weeks at minimum.
I would ask the Planning Commission review the memo and the 6 questions that Community Development Director Harrington had placed on his memo. Please provide written feedback, just so that he has an idea of what we're looking for. We could talk about this until tomorrow, and I can tell he does not want to be here with his mask on. And with that being said, I know there's a lot of things to hammer home, and this is a pretty dry ordinance. So thank you for the hard work on it, but I think that the best thing for us to do is provide feedback and postpone to a date certain. Is there
I'll second that motion if you're making it.
I will make that motion.
Is it July the 24th, is that correct?
I believe so. Danica, do you have this? Yeah, perfect.
Okay.
7 p.m. here at Council Chambers.
Okay, so this will be postponed to a date certain of July 24th at 7 p.m. here in Council Chambers. Moved by Young, seconded by Gearba. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Last one, 24-12 zoning amendment, creating ordinance number 869, an ordinance to amend the zoning ordinance for Appendix A, Article 10, to improve the planned unit development PUD review process. We have a memo dated June 19th, 2024 from Planner Auerbach. Take it away.
Thank you. Are we able to get a copy of the draft up on the screen? I don't think there was a
Yeah, I can send it to Ben.
Okay. So this was an article amendment that we were able to do with funding from the MSHA's Housing Readiness Grant. And in discussion with Mr. Harrington, we reviewed the city's current PUD regulations and made some amendments with the goals of making the whole article a little more user-friendly and readable, and also with making the PUD development option a tool that's more adaptable to different areas in the city, both new greenfield development as well as smaller infield projects in developed areas. So with that said, I'll go through the changes quickly, and then maybe afterwards, if you have specific questions, we can go back to any section as needed. But first with the intent section, we added content there. It's all very general language. I guess what you would expect to find in the intent of zoning is similar to what you'd find in the master plan. The importance with having a very well-articulated intent section is that the Zoning Enabling Act gives local governments a lot of flexibility to define your own PUD process and to pick as broad or narrow a scope as you like as to when and how it'll be used. So it's important to kind of reiterate some things that may be sort of a given when it comes to your zoning ordinance. This is language that we'd recommend as a best practice, and it generally follows what you'd find in your master plan. And so moving on to the 1002 general provisions. Practically speaking, there's no changes here. It keeps sort of the broad application of the PUD tool that is currently allowed under the zoning ordinance. It just reiterates that PUD is a legislative action. It's an amendment to the zoning ordinance. Again, you can choose whether it is a zoning amendment or an administrative action. Long story short, I think our recommendation would be to go to the legislative route. But it just reiterates that it is a rezoning and that it can be applied anywhere in the city, and for residential projects, it has to have existing utility service. So one of the more sections with lengthy changes are the 1003 standards of approval. We consolidated content that was in multiple sections in the current article. Some of it had to do with landscaping and open space preservation, others with density. Put all that content in one place and then took some of those quantitative elements out of it and tried to mirror your other discretionary standards like a special use review, for example. With that, by making those changes, hopefully they would be standards you could still rely on to get you what you want in terms of quality development, environmental preservation, open space, any number of objectives, but still make it more adaptable to both those infill projects and new greenfield development. Let's see, we added section 1004, just summarizing the review process, which in terms of steps is similar to what you have now. It's both a preliminary and final review. Each starts at the Planning Commission and who makes a recommendation to council, who then has the final determination on approval. So that's council, commission, council, commission, council, both for preliminary and final. In addition to that, there's at least one required pre-application meeting. Given the complexity of PUD projects, it's usually a good idea for all parties involved to have that discussion. There's no, the only requirement is that the meeting be held, nothing beyond that. While the process is generally the same, a somewhat significant change is that we change the actual rezoning step from the final PUD approval to the preliminary approval. And the goals with that was to make the process a little more developer-friendly in the sense that they, getting that rezoning is a significant milestone in the entitlement process for them. So giving that a little earlier on could be a bit of a carrot. At the same time, though, we also added a requirement for a written PUD development agreement. So all the critical things, public utilities, roads, et cetera, that would be dedicated, all have to be spelled out in writing at that preliminary stage. And and recorded as part of an agreement. So on one hand, you give a little more flexibility to applicants, but on the other, you make sure that the important stuff is written out and recorded. We also increased the time frame between preliminary and final, just to give a little more leeway. We increased that to 3 years. And then within that 3-year time frame, an applicant would need to submit a final PUD plan approval that would, practically speaking, be similar to a final site plan. And otherwise, the remainder of the language just is procedure for when a PUD project's abandoned, the steps that the city would have to take to, in the event a preliminary PUD was approved, but the project fizzled out for whatever reason, the action that would be necessary for the rezoning to revert back and giving the city authority to do that, et cetera. Also provisions for appeals that is unchanged from your current process. Same with minor amendments. Actually, the appeals minor, that may not be specified, but we added language saying that an appeal process would follow the same procedure for modifying a PUD plan. The rest of the language has to do with performance guarantees and severability, things of that nature. So I'll be happy to take any questions.
And I can just add, too, that this is one of the items we had specifically identified as needing update in our master plan, which is why it's one of the items that MSHDA is funding in actuality. So we currently have very rigid provisions in our PUD. It runs on for quite a bit of time. But really the whole purpose of PUD is to allow people to ask for permissions for unorthodox, non-compliant development based on our codes, but while affording us the tools to make sure that we're happy with whatever it is that they choose to build, that if we're providing a deviation that where we have some standards, A, to evaluate it, and then B, to ensure that they're meeting overall what the goal of our codes and our development standards are. So I guess the two more important things that were removed is one was a cap on the density of projects that it had to match the underlying district. That was not something I'd ever seen prior to coming to Saline, and in reality really defeats the whole purpose of PUD. If you're looking for flexibility, you need to be able to ask for flexibility. And then similarly, we had a very large open space provision of 40%, and the way that was calculated over the years was pretty interesting, to say the least, about how they were finding that open space. And then ultimately, what is the purpose of the open space? Is it to ensure stormwater compliance? Is it to create an aesthetic? Is it to hope for some allotment of public good, like a park area, et cetera? But what we found, if you look at Northview, if you look at Bella Terrace, if you look at Torwood, is you just kind of have these grass fields that languish, that are on weird topography, that maybe could have been another house, or maybe could have been some sort of playground, or it could have been something, but now that it's owned by an HOA and it's private, it's likely going to stay that way for time immemorial. So reducing that and then really relying on our more stringent engineering design standards and on the rest of the provisions here, I think give the city the actual flexibility that a PUD is meant for, and doesn't reduce our position in any way.
Excellent. Thank you. Questions?
Just a couple. So when you do each of these, when we do it now as a rezoning and under PUD, does that mean we're creating its own special district for every single project?
Yes, which is why we're also, subsequent to this, trying to fix 2 of our by right districts to ensure that we stop proliferating these quite as much.
And when we identified 3 years for a plan, we got into a lot of discrepancies when we were doing the issue with Monroe Street property and how long that took to develop. I see other examples. Doesn't 3 years seem a little long, or is that the state standard or benchmark?
It's not a state requirement.
I feel like if we're getting somebody who's coming in and wants to do a development, we don't want to drag it out any longer than we need to. So 3 years gives a long time. We generally are trying to do most of our agreements in less than 180 days for preliminary stuff, and then a year after that. So when starting the 3 years, it seems like such things could change quickly that whole thing would basically be abandoned at some point. And then I think the other mention, I do like the idea that the zoning board of appeals is kind of taken out of the picture. I think that gives it back to the planning commission, just like the other thing. I think that's good. The other one question regarding Oh, the pre-application meeting, it says a minimum of one. Would you want more than one?
I think one is sufficient. We've started doing them more frequently. People really actually enjoy knowing what to expect out of the Planning Commission and City Council, so I think we've had a lot of success in steering development before it's even gone to you. I would say since I started to now, we've really reduced the number of conditions simply by making sure that people are talking to us before they formally submit. I think one is sufficient. I think sometimes they might, as a developer, want 2 or 3. The Pulte's of the world do not want to have to be tied up in local approval process. They want to move. And I think that they're coming to the realization that going through staff beforehand and really understanding what the community is looking for is a far more expedient way to get something approved rather than going through contentious review processes with the Planning Commission and the City Council.
I just want to make sure that you're getting your ability to get in there and check it without, but their assumption making that you're going to have one meeting and solve all the problems.
Yeah, I mean, that has not been my experience with anybody who's taken us up on a pre-application meeting. Like I said, I think they're by and large approving. I don't think we necessarily need to mandate more than one. We can also just reject an application if it's not complete.
And then lastly, when this actually gets rezoned, so they do it on a preliminary order, and a new developer comes in, does it by right change to that new developer, or will it acquires the property, or is it going back to square one?
Someone could assume the responsibilities for the development if it changed hands during that time frame, but it would still be subject to whatever the provisions of that approval were.
So when they start making, if they want to start making changes and everything, it goes back to, it could basically say that this is no longer valid, we have to go back to square one and start a whole development over again.
If they wanted to change it, yes. Yeah.
And what triggers that?
It would be an amendment. It would be, so if someone got, if one applicant got a preliminary approval for certain uses, building locations, all that information on a preliminary plan, the property could change hands. Another developer could take that project and prepare a final site plan based on that approval. If they wanted to change it, it would be sort of the same rules that would apply whether or not it changed hands. It would be a question of whether it's a major or minor amendment. And they'd go from there. So if it was a major amendment, yeah, they'd have to start again, but that's regardless of ownership.
I'll add that most things are a major amendment that would be of concern, especially even if they change like some of the exterior building materials, it can trigger the major amendment. It's always at the staff discretion to say, yeah, that's not, you need to go back to the Planning Commission. Again, the benefit of the rezone aspect at that point too is you're not being rezoned to the underlying district, you're being rezoned to the agreement of the PUD. So it's not as if it's being rezoned to R3 and all of a sudden somebody else buys it and they get this right. If it's a PUD based off the R3 zone, it doesn't really matter what it's based off of. It matters what you approved at that preliminary level to allow those deviations. That you're setting the zoning district when you approve it.
I mean, for me, is making sure that the Monroe Street example should have been done a whole different way, so it could have been a better development and handled it. So whatever we're achieving with this change can be applied to that to make it not only more effective, but speedier and actually holding development requirements on both sides. Whatever this does to achieve that, I'm for it. So if there is any other adjustments that think need to be made other than this, then let us know.
No, I think Planner Auerbach did a great job with this ordinance. It's definitely not one that I had time to write, and not necessarily expertise either, seeing what other communities do. So I think we're at a really good spot with this ordinance.
Any other questions or comments?
I did have one. I simply don't understand. What is the benefit of having the zoning changed upon the preliminary approval as opposed to final approval?
It's, as I mentioned, it's, at least in our experience, it may have benefits for applicants of getting to them to that point in the entitlement process before having to spend all the money on all the final site plan details. But that's the extent of the benefit, as I'm aware.
Yeah, I can comment on that too. A lot of banks make their loans conditional on rezoning, that you have at least the land use right to build what you say you want to build. So this is something they talked about at the National Planning Conference, but it's, like I said, a lot of other planning groups are talking about it simply to try to connect the dots of why isn't housing getting built. But that's definitely one point. The rezoning is a major milestone as far as financiers are concerned at supplying developers and funds. So having the funds at the rezoning level earlier in the process allows them to access more cash for the engineering reviews that are much more depthful for that final process.
Thank you, that's helpful. And then after 3 years, would there have to be an act of the council to revert it to the underlying zoning, or assuming it's not, a final PUD is not approved?
Believe so. Yes, City Council shall be entitled to take necessary and appropriate action to rescind the preliminary plan approvals, to invalidate any related agreements, and to rezone the subject property from PUD to an appropriate classification. I'd have to do a little more research to see if just sort of an automatic reversion is common practice, but I suspect that, especially since an agreement's in play, that the action may be necessary.
Okay, thank you.
I appreciate the hard work on this. The three things that I would like to hit home is I appreciate the pre-application meeting. I'm sure that's very helpful to lay it out on the table of what is expected, so thank you. The 3 years I also think might be a little generous to developers. I think maybe that should be rolled back a little bit more. And also about the conditions, noting that conditions need to be articulated on the plans before approval. I'm glad that we're going back and making sure that all the conditions have been met, but just putting it in this ordinance makes it very clean and neat for us. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
One question.
Yes.
Section 1010 on the performance guarantees, how will that be determined? Is there going to be some kind of percentage, some kind of aspects that need to be completed? We've always talked about that, but we've never, ever implemented it where we've actually put significant performance bonds or guarantees in place.
Is this an escrow for review?
That would be for completion of site improvements. So we just referenced the existing ordinance section, and it's usually.
I can read it. I have it pulled up here. It actually goes back to the fee book that we have, because the building department does charge performance guarantees and actually calls the treasurer out here. The applicant shall deposit a cash bond, irrevocable letter of credit, or other surety as approved by the city with the city treasurer after a building permit has been issued, but prior to issuance of an occupancy permit for any site improvements contained in the approved final site plan, such as but not limited to streets, grading, landscaping, parking, screens, et cetera. So we do collect site bonds, both through our engineering fees, and then we collect individual unit surety bonds through building permits. So we do collect bonds. The question is whether they're enough. That's something that Tesha, I think, has been working with us on, is are we charging enough for bonds? Can we raise the bond? I think there's also some state issues with that as well, if I'm not mistaken. So.
Yeah, and just knowing that if we're putting this in here, that understanding that we can and make sure that they're significant or appropriate enough to complete some of those issues, especially when it comes to roads and sewers or stuff.
Yeah, we have the temporary certificate of occupancy, which is not a bond, but it's a $200 stick to essentially a month every month to get you to do that. So we've already gotten some complaints on it, which is probably not the worst thing because we need people to close out their sites.
Additional questions? Is there a motion on the table to acknowledge the receipt of the memo dated June 19th from Planner Auerbach?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion on the table to open the public hearing at 8:33?
I'll move to open the public hearing.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. All public comments will be heard, a limit of 3 minutes per person.
Noting no one from the public present, I'd move to close the public hearing at 8:33.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Additional questions or comments from the Planning Commission members?
I guess just one. The question that's come up by two of my colleagues on the duration, expressing some concern or consternation that 3 years is too long. Is that common, or in your judgment, would 2 suffice, be appropriate?
I think 2 would be, there'd be no issue with that. Is that what should be a number you'd be more comfortable with?
I can't speak for the group. I would.
Same here. I would feel comfortable with 2. Because once that preliminary part is done, they can start moving dirt on that property. They walk after that. then it just makes the property gunky, and for lack of a better explanation. But I think 2 should be enough.
Is there any provision for requesting an extension just in case there were circumstances that we felt would warrant an extension?
Yes, we've got some options in here.
Okay. Yeah, I would support 2.
Unless there's objection from the dais, I would recommend that the 3-year period be adjusted to 2.
Anybody else?
I didn't have any specific questions on this one. I'll let Mike take the lead on it. I will also just add, too, they cannot start moving dirt after the preliminary approval. It just rezones. It gives them the same authority that a preliminary site plan does, unless I missed something.
Oh, no, unless you've got, I know some communities allow for that at the preliminary stage. An applicant can begin grading, but otherwise, no, it would have to, they couldn't start moving dirt to the final.
Yeah, we don't, I can double check that, but I don't believe we necessarily have that provision. I think, again, there are some other interesting examples in the city where a developer had phased a large project and that provided them the ability to move dirt from one side of the road to the other or one side of the railroad tracks to the other, which then became an issue, so.
We had one example where someone moved dirt, they didn't own the property.
Yeah.
Similar issue, they get rezoning. But would that just be PUD, or was that in general, you're saying?
In general, my understanding is that we do not allow work to begin prior to final site plan approval, which in this case would be final PUD approval.
More reinforcing that now than you probably have.
Yeah, I'm not necessarily a fan of people doing work before they've been approved to do the work. So.
No additional questions or comments? Is there a motion on the table to recommend to the Policy Subcommittee for Saline City Council to adopt or not adopt the new ordinance 869?
Second.
Any additional questions or comments? No. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Discussion tonight? Seeing none?
Do we have a meeting, do we have any action items for that first meeting in July or no?
No.
Okay.
We had 2 site plan submittals. One is definitely not complete and will need to be sent back to the applicant, so that'll likely be the first or second meeting in August. The other one is the final site plan for Just a Few's Autos on North Ann Arbor Street. I just have to pen that that's fully completed, and then that will likely be on the second meeting in July, along with the follow-up on the temporary structures and uses.
Very good.
Can you give an update a little bit on Thorncrest, which is going to be on the agenda on Monday?
Yeah, so the city is seeking permission to file, or if necessary, to file a nuisance abatement in circuit court against Thorncrest Estates. It's been over a year since our rental inspection program has existed. 0 out of 120 of their units are certified and deemed meeting the standards of the International Property Maintenance Code, which I'll add as a minimum standard. There are numerous issues throughout the property. There are numerous tenant complaints this winter about people lacking heat. We had to respond rather quickly to many of those because boilers were not working. We recently, in the summer, we did our first round of inspections in December. In the summer, though, we've now realized that there are foundation issues on several of the buildings where water is literally pouring into their basements. I'll add, nuisance abatement does not mean condemning the buildings or declaring them unsafe. That is absolutely not our goal. Our goal is to ensure through that type of process that the people there have someone who's collecting rent and using the rent to reinvest in the property to bring it up to those minimum standards. That compliance is the overall goal. I think that when the city takes this action, there will likely be conversations of displacement or targeting, which again, it's the exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish with such a court action. The action will likely be joined by the city of Milan as well. The property owner owns another site in Milan with very, very similar issues, much to no one's surprise. And there are also other entities that help fund the housing at Thorncrest too that would likely be able to provide us additional recourse against the property owner to ensure that these issues are brought into compliance. But there are many. I think the first inspection report was something like 90 pages, which is almost a page per unit, which is just appalling, is really what it is. So.
And then speaking of other abandoned buildings, the car wash.
Yeah, so the action we can pursue against 121 Sage Court is dangerous buildings, coincidentally, I can't say it, I'm not going to try. In order to do that, though, we have to appoint a dangerous buildings officer. We were in the process of doing that last year when this was before it was then going to be a dispensary. And then the person we had lined up for that has since moved companies, and now would be a conflict of interest to have him as our dangerous buildings officer. So with the help of Code Enforcement Services, we're seeking to find a dangerous buildings officer to appoint so that we can then begin that formal enforcement process. I hope that one will go much more smoothly, though, and be more expedient, as it's not a court process necessarily. It's like an internal city process that's just defined by state statute.
And you just reminded me, the last question I had was the other marijuana facility. When does that?
Yeah, I need to check on the status of their permits because I think it's likely been 6 months since they applied. They started doing work without a permit in December, I believe. So we're hitting that 6-month mark now. And then I'll have to work with legal counsel on it. We dismissed the other ones because their preliminary site plan expired. Since they had a final site plan that then they pulled building permits on, it extends the longevity and validity of that site plan to a certain degree. But I believe if in 6 months from now they don't have it open or there's a certificate of occupancy without a very good excuse or reason, we'll be able to dismiss them as well and retract their approval, essentially. But I have to confirm that. It's 6 months to a year is essentially the timeline they have to open it.
Thanks for updating, and then I know that somebody kept asking about it, and I kept saying, I thought it was tied up on the permits. Thank you.
Yeah, it's not tied up on the city's end. It's,
In terms of extending it out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Madam Chair, I'd move to excuse the absence of our colleague Jessica Lafort.
I'll second. All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Is there a motion to adjourn at 8:41 PM?
So moved.
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion passes. Thank you. Have a great night.